All right, for our research methods class today, we are going over the scientific method. We're going to talk a little bit about Aristotle. I don't talk about him too much here because I cover him and his work in more depth in some other classes, but we're going to just sort of stick to what is useful for this course, and then there might be some add-on information depending on the other courses you take with me. So before we get going on understanding research methods and the scientific method, we have to think about which type of questions are we asking? All right, so when you enter into research, there are three main questions that you can ask. One are questions of metaphysics, the second are questions of epistemology, and the third are questions of morality. So let's talk about what these three questions entail as far as why it is you're asking them, and then what sort of answers are you looking for within research. So metaphysics questions are questions about what is, what exists. Can we go around and explain the world as it is? All right, that's a metaphysics question. One of the oldest metaphysics questions out there is, does God exist? Right, and people look for evidence for or against the existence of God, right? But you go around and you just say, like, what is true about how the world works? That's the question you're asking. Epistemology, which I think is a fascinating field of study. It's one of those things where if I was to go back to school and get more degrees, I would probably focus really heavily in on epistemologies, some sort of history of just, university and knowledge creation, etc. What you're looking at with regard to epistemological questions is, how do we know what we know exists? So now you're starting to trace the lineage of where the information that you have access to, where did it come from? Did it come from your own experience? Did you read it in a book? Did you get the information from a teacher? Right? How do we know what we know? That's an epistemological question. All right. The third type of question you can ask is a question of morality. Now, sometimes when people hear the word morality, they go immediately to a religious context for it, which is understandable. Don't think about morality in this instance as a question of you need to act in a certain way because if you don't, you're a sinner and God's going to hate you and damn you to hell, right? Think of a morality question as follows. Now that we know how the world actually works, what do we do now that we have that information, right? What are the best values and behaviors I can implement in my life based on how do I know the world works? So if you have this sort of very carefree attitude about life, maybe you're very sort of libertarian, sort of in your direction about allowing people to live however it is they want to live, which is totally fine, if that's what your politics dictate, right? There's a difference between going around and saying, look, everyone should just sort of live however they want to, right? And then the research part of this morality question is, but just because you want to live a certain way doesn't mean that that way is going to foster the best results for your life moving forward, all right? So if we think about a very liberal attitude towards drugs, and you might say, look, I think, drugs should be legal. All types of drugs should be legal, right? The morality question is, well, what do we know about drug and alcohol and intoxicant consumption, and what sort of results it is going to lead to most of the time for a large percentage of individuals who regularly participate in intoxicant abuse, right? So you might say, look, I think all drugs should be legal, but the morality question is, based on what we know about drug use and the long-term effects of drugs, we might want to behave in a way that is that has some temperance to it, right? We might want to behave with some restriction, right? We might want to abstain altogether. All right, so it isn't a judgment question of I'm judging people in this instance. I judge people who use drugs as some sort of moral sinners against God's creation, right? But it's a question of, even if we say like people should be able to live their life the way they want to, what a morality question does in the social sciences specifically is it shows people this is how the world works, and if you want to foster the best life possible for yourself, here are some prescriptions for you with regard to how you should think about living your life, because the world works in a certain way, and if you do these things, you are more likely to get ahead. A more controversial example of this would be something with regard to family structures, specifically how children are raised and who children are raised by. All right. So there are plenty of mixed and blended ways in which a family can exist, right? The two biological parents stay married together. They have kids, and that's a household, right? That's a traditional household. You could have same-sex couples who adopt, or same-sex couples where one of the couple is a parent, and then there's a donor for either the XX or the XY chromosome. Um, you can have blended families with regard to divorce, right? And step families. You could have single mothers or single fathers. You could have kids raised by their aunts or uncles or grandparents or whoever, right? So there's multiple ways in which kids grow up in households, right? So the morality question, again, isn't this sort of like church question of I cast, judgment upon you if your family is not traditional. The morality question is which environment that a child is raised in will most likely lead to the best long-term results for that child's education and financial success. All right. And what we know, and we'll talk a little bit about, I'll use this as an example later on, is that a child raised in a two-parent household with biological mom and biological dad, probability-wise, has the most likely chance of success with regard to education, long-term financial success, abstaining from drugs and alcohol, and dangerous sexual activity in high school and college, right? So it's not that those other ways of having a family are bad ways, but a morality question in the social sciences is what is the probability, the best way to live out one's life in order to get the best results possible, all right? So these are the three types of questions. Metaphysics, how does the world work? Epistemology, how is it that we know what we know, right? Through the scientific method, through experience, through reading people who've engaged in the scientific method, textbooks, teachers, etc. And then the morality question is, how should people act and behave in order to get the results they want, all right? So keep that in mind. I know the morality thing gets extremely controversial because it does sound as if you are judging other people's behaviors. But it's not judgment in this religious purity way. But it is measuring various behaviors of individuals and then being able to tell the broader public, look, I did some research, and if you engage in these types of behaviors based on how the world actually is, the metaphysics question, if you engage in these types of behaviors, it seems as if you are probability-wise more likely to succeed in the ways you want to succeed. All right. I guess one more example of this would be something like nutrition, right? A metaphysics question is like, this is a donut and this is a vegetable. And then the morality question is, look, you can eat either the donut or the vegetable, right? But the morality question is like, how should you behave as far as food consumption with regard to what are your, health and fitness goals? All right. Now, obviously, it's like eat the vegetable as opposed to the donut, right? You could eat both, right? But probability-wise, you're probably going to have more long-term success if you want to, have a more, stable, health, and fitness goals. All right. So these are the three types of questions you can ask when you are going into academic research. We have this guy Aristotle here. He wrote lots of things. This one we're talking about specifically is the rhetoric. All right. And what Aristotle does for us with regard to the scientific method is he starts to lay the foundation about about 2,000 years ago, for sort of how to work your way through an argument and work your way through the scientific method. All right. It took us about 1,500 years, so until about the Middle Ages, around the year 1500 AD. It took us about that long to sort of fully implement this. All right. But Aristotle sort of lays the groundwork. So this is what he's doing. So we have Socrates. Socrates is sort of the father of philosophy who goes around and says, we should be allowed to ask questions, right? We should be able to question people in positions of authority. You should read Plato's Apology if you haven't yet. Then after Socrates, his student is Plato, and then after Plato, his student is Aristotle. Aristotle kind of looks back on the work of Socrates saying we should be able to question authority. And Aristotle says, look, now that we're allowed to ask questions, Socrates has sort of paved the way to help us give permission to ask questions. How do we ask the best questions possible in order to get the answers that we want to get or that we need to get in order to better understand the world? So Aristotle lays out some of our first understanding of things like what are known as logic. We think about this word empiricism, right? Empiricism, the way I like to think about empiricism is this small lane of brick upon brick upon brick for a very long time of small little chunks of data, right? Go very, very slow with the data so that when you finally get to your conclusion, you have a nice solid foundation for which your conclusion can lay upon, right? There's a lot of people who want to say like, I observe A and therefore I conclude X. You got a lot of letters between A and X. Empiricism says, I'm observing A. How does that relate to my observation of B? And then C, and then D. And I pile on data in a very slow, meticulous way, and then I reach conclusion X, and now X is on a lot firmer foundation than just saying like, I saw this thing, therefore I conclude whatever it is I want to conclude. So Aristotle gives us sort of the foundation and form for how to argue, like here's how you should lay out a good argument. Cicero comes in a little bit later, and Cicero says there's more to argumentation than just having a good, sound, wonky argument. You also need to have style and art and charisma. So this goes back to some of the discussions I've had with regard to politicians. The politicians with the best ideas don't always win because we go around and we say, which politician would I like to have a beer with? Which one seems like I would invite to Thanksgiving dinner? Who do I want to hang out with? Who seems cool? Right? Cicero understood that even though all those questions are stupid when it comes to electing a president should have good, solid ideas that actually work, right? I'm never going to have a beer with the president, so what do I care, right? But Cicero knew that the masses of individuals like to see people who are charismatic and just looks as if they are fun to be around. Method for following good logic, depending on the book you open, it might be 5 steps, it might be 7 steps. I like these 5. And I have the word conclusion highlighted because, as you see, conclusion is step number 4. All right. Too many people, especially when we're talking about cable news, they get on cable news, they're like, the president did something, here's my conclusion about it. It's like, hold on, you forgot to observe, describe, analyze, and then conclude. All right. Observation is like, can you go out into the world and just tell me what you're seeing without any sort of judgment? If we're talking about social scientific, if we're talking about political policy, for instance, the observation would be like, did you read the bill, right? Joe Biden was just inaugurated as president. I think I just saw he signed in 19 executive actions thus far. You might like them, you might not like them, but my first question to you is, can you observe it? Like, did you just read the executive orders? Don't tell me if you like them or you hate them. I want to know first that you observed them, that you read them. All right. Then can you describe it? All right. Can you sort of give me some sort of thematic analysis of it? Can you tell me what's going on? Like, what does it actually mean? Right? Can you paraphrase the executive order? And then you analyze it. The analysis is where all that APA cross-referencing goes on. So in the analysis, what you do is you start taking sort of today's information and you start relating it to things that we already know. How is this like previous presidents' executive orders? Let's say you go out into the world, let's say you're a botanist, right? You go out in the world and you're just observing the forest. Can you just observe the forest? Describe it. Can you tell me how big are the trees? How big are the flowers? What color are they? The analysis is, I come across a new flower that I've never seen before. Can I describe that flower in relation to other flowers that I know of as far as similarities? Like, this new flower looks as if it belongs in a specific family of flowers. All right, that's the analysis. What else is this like that I already know about? And this is why we have academic citations. We go in and we say, I have this new analysis, and this analysis, look at all these other people who have said similar things. I can connect my new work to all of this previous information because I've read all the material. I can talk intelligently about this new flower I found because I know what all these other flowers are about. All right. So that's what you need to be able to do. You can't just say, Joe Biden is great or Joe Biden is terrible. You have to say, okay, like, tell me other presidents who have acted in a certain way. Can you compare him to what he's done, or what other presidents have done with regard to executive orders, for instance, right? That's the analysis. Be a learned person with regard to the history. Then you reach a conclusion. Then you can tell me whether or not it's good or bad. I don't want to hear whether or not you think it's good or bad until you can observe, describe, analyze, and then conclude. Finally, we get to the evaluation situation. The evaluation is like after I've gone through this whole exercise, I still have some further questions or new questions have popped up that I think I'm going to try to explore the next time around. All right? Observe, describe, analyze, conclude. Evidence-based arguments, all arguments should be based in evidence. So you should make a claim, right? I think that X is true, and then you need to back it up with evidence, all right? Evidence should be logical. It should be based in facts, stats, and definitions. Now, here's the thing with sort of like the pathos appeal, the emotional appeal. So you should base your stuff in logos, right? Logos, pathos, ethos. You should base it in logos. You should base it in logic. But pathos is effective, as Cicero has taught us, right? Cicero says emotion, like being able to connect with people on an emotional level is important in order to get your point across. However, emotional appeal should be used anecdotally to give life and to give color to the logos, right? But the conclusion should be driven by the logos, by the evidence. So let me give you two examples, all right? Here's a good example of an emotional appeal, all right? So you could say, look, I don't know if these statistics are true or not, so just go with it, okay? But let's say you have the following information. Approximately 1/3 of all people will get cancer. Here is a story, an emotional appeal. Here's a story about a family member of mine who has had cancer, all right? This is a good example because I start off with the logos. Here are the amount of people who are affected by cancer. Numbers are kind of boring. They're very impersonal. Right? If I just get up there and I rattle off a bunch of numbers about cancer and patients and costs and everything else, you're going to get bored with the numbers. So to give life and to give color to that story, I say, okay, anecdotally, I'm going to draw you into these numbers by telling you an emotional story about one of my family members who's had cancer. All right? So you have the logos. The emotional appeal helps to support the logos, but the emotional appeal is not the basis for your entire argument with regard to, if you're talking about, raising money for cancer research. This is a bad example, this next one. This bad example would read something like this. I know someone who was abused by the police, therefore all police should wear body cameras. This is a bad example because I start off with an emotional appeal, right? Here's an anecdotal story about a person I know who was abused by the police, and now I'm going to reach a conclusion that says all police should wear body cameras. In this example, you don't give us any factual information with regard to larger statistics. Maybe that person who was abused by the police is the only person ever abused by the police ever in the history of policing. Probably not, but that's the conclusion an audience member could make. As an audience member, before you start giving me big sweeping policy recommendations, I want to know, okay, you told me a story about your friend, this one person you know. In a country of 330 million people, how many people are abused by the police every year? How many complaints are filed against the police every year, right? How much money does it cost to settle lawsuits with regard to people suing police departments, right? I want to know all the stats and facts and information. You can give me some anecdotes, right? You can tell me the story about your friend, right? But make sure that it's backed up with stats, facts, and information before you start giving me sweeping policy recommendations that are going to affect everyone. All right, before I'm going to go out there and ask for millions of dollars for cancer research, I want to know the amount of people affected by it and how much it costs an average family to get through the treatment, right? Don't start off with the emotional appeal. Facts, stats, and definitions should drive your argument. Use the emotional appeals to kind of, give it a little bit of color commentary. All right, so evidence-based arguments. Emotional appeals come later. Just as a reference, people who only use emotional appeals are known as demagogues, right? They're being demagogic. They're sort of overblowing the emotional appeals because usually they don't have a lot of facts, stats, and definitions to back it up, or they just don't know it and they haven't done their research. So if you ever get into an argument with someone or you see someone on the news arguing and they are only using emotional appeals or anecdotal stories, and they're not actually giving you facts, stats, definitions about how much things are going to cost, or how many people are, abused by the police every year, or how many people are currently in prison for like non-violent drug offenses, right? You at some point you have to get to the numbers. Same thing is true with tax policy. If people just get out there and talk about like we need to raise taxes or lower taxes because of my emotional wanting, I don't want to hear it. I want to know, how much do people currently pay in taxes? What are the different tax brackets? Give me specific numbers, right? And then we can talk about tax policy, and we can have the sort of emotional connection with regard to making sure that our communities are taken care of through taxes, right? But at some point, if you want to make a good argument, if you want to convince me, or if you want someone to be able to convince you, you have to get to the numbers and the facts. You can't just sit there and say, we need to raise taxes to help people. Okay, that's emotional. I need some facts and I need some numbers, all right? How much, what's the current rate, all this other kind of stuff. All right, when do logical arguments and widely accepted conclusions change? When there's new evidence interjected into the conversation. So if I was a king who was able to censor speech, which, just for politicians, not for anybody else, but if I could, just for politicians, not that I would want to, but if I could, these are two of the statements I would take out of, I would make it illegal for politicians to say, right? They say things like the science is settled or the debate is over. None of these statements aren't ever true, all right? And we know they're not true because new evidence is always being interjected into the conversation. Now this doesn't mean that we don't act. It doesn't mean that we just dismiss all evidence and say, well, I guess we can never really know what's true, so I'm not going to act. No, what we say is, based on the current evidence we have today, this is the best course of action to take moving forward. All right, so I know a lot of people are going to come at me about, well, climate change and I don't know, taxes and whatever else, like COVID relief funds. Like, okay, I get it. Make the best policy decision you can today based on the evidence, but that doesn't mean the science is settled. It doesn't mean we know everything. It just means that we are constantly trying to update our information and our data as new evidence comes out. And there are going to be times when we need to be humble enough to realize that new evidence is going to come out and prove a lot of things that we thought were correct are actually wrong. And the reason I know that is because we've done that to past generations. All right, you should not be so conceited and arrogant to think that people in the year 2021 have it all figured out. 100 years from now, people are going to look back on our generation of 2021 and say, man, those people back in 2021 had some really weird ideas. I can't believe they ever thought that. I don't know what questions, obviously we don't know what they're going to say that about yet. But we do know that looking back 100 years to the year 1921, we look back on some of those very important scholars and leaders of our country and say, like, I can't believe those people actually thought this thing. What a weird idea to have. All right. So science is never settled. The debate's never over. If you want to engage in the debate or push back against, sort of consensus or conventional wisdom of the day, it's like you need to have good evidence. You can't just say, like, I disagree with the scientists because I want to. You have to say, like, here's new evidence, scientists, look at this new evidence, all right? So it's not just enough to say, like, I don't like your opinion, all right? Introduce new evidence, try to, if you want to overturn the current science, fine, but you need to have better, more convincing evidence that can lead to a major change in the thinking of the scientific community. All right, but the science is never settled. The debate is never over about anything. All right. So here's a couple ideas that have changed throughout the world. We call these superseded scientific theories. And what these are essentially are theories that used to exist and everyone used to agree were true. And then a big new piece of evidence came into our world and completely flipped the theory over, right? So a couple ideas here, right? We used to believe the earth was flat. We took some measurements. Well, we didn't, like people a long time ago took some measurements, started making some observations. They're like, the earth's not flat. We used to believe that human beings were out of Asia, right? And then we got new evidence. Someone was digging around in Africa and they're like, hey, I found a bone and it's older, right? Okay, so now we have the consensus is that human beings are out of Africa, all right? The azoic hypothesis is that was the idea that life could not exist below 300 fathoms, and then we just got better submarines. We went below 300 fathoms and we found all these life forms. We're like, I can't believe this stuff exists. There's no light, there's no oxygen, the pressure is insane, right? But there's life down here, okay? So we used to think that this was true, like everybody. This is an interesting one, to say the least. This happened about 100 years ago when we were arguing as to whether or not women should have the right to vote. one of the hypotheses put forward is that, women have smaller heads and therefore they have smaller brains. And so they must be a little bit less intelligent. So that's one reason why they shouldn't vote, right? Obviously, we look back now 100 years ago and we're like, we can't believe what those people were thinking, right? But that was a widely discussed theory with regard to women and men and head size and brain size. What we found out since is yes, on average, women have smaller heads, and yes, on average, women have smaller brains, but it doesn't mean that they're less intelligent, because intelligence has to do with the proportionality of the brain to the body, as opposed to just sort of like the actual size. All right. So because men are a little bit just sort of like proportionally bigger, women are proportionally a little bit smaller, it's fine that their heads and their brains are a little bit smaller, because intelligence has to do with proportionality, as opposed to, just the size. All right. Back during Reconstruction, right? Unfortunately, post-Civil War, there was this big discussion on, like, okay, all these slaves have been freed. And in the South, obviously, they institute things like Jim Crow and segregation. And people just thought that blacks and whites had sort of evolved differently with regard to species, and therefore, like, they couldn't live together. All right. And this was a widely accepted theory. Again, unfortunately, in places like Harvard and Princeton, right, there was, professors at these institutions who were advocating for these, very racist theories. All right. We used to think we were a geocentric universe. The Earth was the center of the universe. That got flipped over. Then we were like, the sun's the center of the universe. Now we're like, the sun's not even the center of the universe. All right. The sun's not even the center of the Milky Way. It's like on this like outer suburb of the Milky Way. Alternative medicine is all nonsense. All right. And we used to think Pluto was a planet. We took some more measurements. We're like, Pluto's not a planet, which is sad. All right. So here's some things. Here we go. You have these crystals. Some people put them on their heads and stuff and say, it's healing. It's not. Here's an old map that shows a Earth-centered universe. Obviously, that's overturned. Phrenology. You might have seen some of these kind of skulls or these heads in like old movies in like a doctor's office. What they did is they had all this writing on it. A doctor would feel your head, and if there were certain bumps in certain places, the doctor would be like, oh, that's probably what's causing you headaches or anxiety, or there's a little bump here and it indicates some sort of personality disorder. People used to think this was true. Based on the bumps of your head, they could sort of diagnose, your personality or your ailments. It's all garbage, right? But looking back, I try not to be so arrogant to looking back, people, let me rephrase. People in their time were doing the best they could with the best evidence and tools that they had available to them. I get a little bit, I'm probably more arrogant than I need to be. I look back and say, this is ridiculous, because it is ridiculous. However, that was the best available evidence, and people were trying to do the best they could to help people, right? Doctors were trying to do the best they could with regard to medicine, and so this was one theory that was explored that was later overturned. I guess the same thing is probably true with alternative medicine. I guess if you're, if you have a persistent ailment, doing some sort of alternative medicine or crystal therapy or whatever, I get it. People are trying to do the best they can to cure their ailments. There's no evidence that any of it works. There you have it. Over here, just around my head here, I don't have the full, I do have a pic, you can Google it, but it's a disgusting racist evolutionary chart that used to be in textbooks that shows how different races of different people evolve, right? And sort of like, who our closest cousins are with regard to what race you're from. So this is just an old textbook with regard to, how do different races of people evolve to try to indicate that people of different racial backgrounds should be segregated because they're actually sort of different species. Yeah, awful, horrible, but it's a super scientific theory that you should be aware of, right? This was an idea that people used to have, and I'm glad that people came in, found new evidence, and said this is all a bunch of bunk. Some current ideas that are currently being debated back and forth. So again, the debate's never over. Every couple years, I feel like somebody tells me eggs are terrible, don't eat them because it's going to raise your cholesterol. And then the next year, someone comes in and says, eggs are great, eat as many as you want. Same thing with coffee. I don't know if coffee is good for you or bad for you. I drink it every morning, lots of it, because I love it. But sometimes people are like, drink some coffee, but not too much. But maybe if you drink more, it'll cure cancer, but it'll give you this other kind of cancer. Who knows? Back in the 50s and 60s, we took all the fat out of food because we thought fat makes you fat. And we replaced all the fat with sugar because food without fat in it is gross. And so we're like, what will make it delicious? Let's put a bunch of sugar in it. And lo and behold, we find out that sugar makes us fat, right? So we just got fatter after we took all the fat out of the food because we're replacing it with sugar, and it just made things worse. So people keep debating with regard to what's a good nutrition plan for us. We debate, the usefulness of drugs and alcohol. Is it good or is it bad? Some people say, well, drink a little red wine because it's got, some different chemicals in it that'll be good for you. And people are like, just eat a piece of fruit and you'll be fine. Some people say don't drink any alcohol. Some people say 1 glass a day is okay, depending on like body weight and this other stuff. Here's some political and social theories that we go back and forth on. I talked a little bit about earlier about there's big social scientific debates that are landmines. But things like two-parent households and children, very serious scholars who are trying to solve these problems of making sure that every child has the best possibility in life. They go around and they have to study these hard, difficult questions that nobody else will touch because it seems like this very sort of judging proposition to go around and say, single parent households are not the best environment for children with regard to the probability that they'll be successful. However, like it needs to be studied and looked at, and people go back and forth with regard to what's the best way to raise a child so that child finishes school, doesn't get involved in illicit activity that inhibits him or her from finishing school, and then sort of sets that child up for long-term future financial success. All right, so here's some other, lots of things that we continue to debate with regard to what's good or what's bad or how we should structure a society. All right, the debate's not over. People have good evidence on all sides of these issues. You can look them up if you want to. Finally, we need to know about Occam's Razor. This handsome devil named William of Occam. He was around in 13th, 14th century, and his whole idea was, I'm going to just read the quote here, all things being equal, the simplest solution tends to be the best one. All right, the simplest solution tends to be the best solution. All right, so we have a couple quotes here. One's from Isaac Newton, which you are welcome to read on your own. I'm going to read this one from Thomas Sowell, who is still around. He's 90 years old. Down and below, there was just a documentary made on Thomas Sowell's life. I'll go ahead and link it down here. It's from this organization called Free to Choose, so you can check it out. But he says, so what Thomas Sowell writes, which is similar to this Occam's Razor, right? Like if you have two propositions for conclusions, the simplest one is probably the correct one, right? So what Sowell writes is that if academic writing, right? So he's being very critical of academia. If academic writing were difficult, right, to read, right, because of the deep thoughts involved, that might be understandable even if frustrating. Seldom is that the case. However, all right, jaw-breaking words often cover up for very sloppy thinking. So what Sowell is saying is if you have an idea or you have a conclusion, and it takes you a very long time to explain it, and you have all these exceptions, and you're like, well, that's true, but there's another way to view it, and you cannot explain your ideas in very simple layman terms to a person who's not in your field, it's probably because you have a bad conclusion. It's probably because your ideas are very, very sloppy, all right? So Sowell, Newton, Occam, like they would all go back and say, look, find a simpler explanation for this. Otherwise, you just have all these like, there's an exception, there's an exception, there's an exception. A good kind of piece of advice that I got when I was in graduate school, when it came to writing, because graduate students were all very like, oh my God, I'm a graduate student, I'm gonna have the best idea ever. And slowly you realize like, nope, you don't. But because of that, we write these graduate students, they write these very long sentences that are like the length of a paragraph because they have all of these little transitional phrases to try to keep explaining themselves. And an advisor of mine once told me, look, your sentences are too long. Nobody can follow them. And it's very sloppy thinking. He said, try to write a sentence where when you say it out loud, you can get through the sentence in one breath. And if you can't get through the sentence in one breath, it's too long of a sentence. Now, that's not always the case, right? There's plenty of sentences that, have, conjunctions in them, right? However, it's a good sort of thing to think about when you're writing sentences or you're trying to get an idea across. If you say, here's my conclusion, and you're just meandering through the woods and no one can follow you, it's probably because it's a very sloppy conclusion. You need to go back and you need to reassess. The word for this, right, parsimonious, aim for what are known as parsimonious explanations, right? Simple, to the point, very concise, very beautiful little explanations for whatever conclusion it is you are reaching. Okay, that's all I have for the scientific method and Aristotle. I'll see you all next time.